All right, here we are this morning with Justin Nickerson, head of Apollo Auctions, who has won the Australian Auctioneer of the Year award 3 times and is undoubtedly a great voice in the real estate industry. Thank you for joining us this morning,
Pleasure,
Justin.
good to be here, Will.
Let's take a step back. What pushed you into the role of an auctioneer, back in your early 20s rather than a normal sales role?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I was in sales,
Yep.
so I was selling real estate. I wouldn't say I had a huge passion for it, but I was selling in an area where I'd grown up, a bit like you, family roots in the area, played a bit of football in the area, so I just knew kind of quite a few people. But what I really enjoyed and what I still enjoy is negotiation. That's a key part of the role of an auctioneer here in Southeast Queensland. And really auctioneers, we negotiate kind of extensively or for a living. So the ability to do more than that, more of that was kind of what drew me in, and made a big jump at a seminal moment many years ago. And yeah, it's been a pretty cool ride ever since.
Yep. So with auctioneering, it's got a fair amount of public speaking, speaking to large crowds. Has that always been a talent of yours, or?
Absolutely not. No, I didn't do any debating, no public speaking at school, nothing of that. And in fact, it was when I sort of became an auctioneer, it was almost, that was the bit I had to sort of learn to overcome to become an auctioneer, is that public speaking side of it. I wouldn't say I was ever like terrified or scared of it. I just don't think I was particularly good at it. But it's something that, like any skill, the more you develop, the more you practice it, the more it becomes second nature. And now I'd say I'm pretty comfortable in that space just because I've done it so often. But it wasn't something that came easily. It's something that took a lot of work, and it's been a lot of effort and time invested into getting to sort of where we are today.
One thing I've noticed that you do very, very well at your auctions is that you keep them lighthearted. So during an auction, the buyer's nervous, the seller's nervous, the agent's very nervous, but you have this ability to be able to throw a joke in or say something that keeps the crowd, entrenched in the auction.
Yeah.
Was that something that just came naturally to you? You've always had a quip?
Yeah, I always think the best auctioneers are really authentic versions of themselves. What we try and teach our team now is that an auction is not like a stage show where you should be having a normal conversation and then you leave that conversation and then you're like a performer, in a different manner, and then, get a British accent and then you step off that and go back into a conversation. So I think authentically the person I am is I'm pretty calm. I think I'm pretty relaxed. And I'm usually pretty quick to a bit of humour, and that's kind of what comes through as me as an auctioneer, I think, or what I try and represent. But I think it's also an involvement of what an auctioneer has become. So, as veterans in the industry, you and I, back when we first started, the auctioneers were always male. They were the dominant figure that were loud and aggressive, and they were the boss. Whereas it's changed now. The auctioneer is the facilitator of the auction, and you're going to get more from crowds if you make them feel good rather than make them feel intimidated.
Yep.
But yeah, everyone's a bit nervous, particularly at your auctions. You're probably the most nervous person at most of the auctions. So, our job is to try and, we can't chase those nerves all the way, but we can definitely make people feel a little bit more comfortable.
If you were giving advice to a buyer, they were going to their first auction, it might be their first home or it might be just the first time they're going to an auction, what advice do you give them if you give that sort of advice out prior, or what would you give that to people out there that might be listening?
Yeah, I definitely have a plan. That's the first one. Is so many people walk into an auction without a strategy.
I'll see what happens.
Yeah, and that's not a strategy. That's a hope, and it's like hoping you win the lotto without buying a ticket.
Yep.
The reality is that if you want to buy the property, you have to bid. So if your strategy is anything other than bidding, you can't win. Like, you have a 0% chance of winning. So have a strategy and have a plan when you walk into there, and just execute inside that plan. And look, if you give it a crack and you get beaten by someone who either wants it more or someone who's got a bigger budget, that's okay. But if you walk in and then you don't do anything and then you handle paddle back, what was the point of that exercise? So there's different figures that we coach around, which is effectively your dream figure that you'd love to buy it for, the fair figure that you think is about where you think it would likely sell. And then the last one is your absolute, where you can't go any higher than that, or you won't go any higher than that. Once you have those three figures, you're just working inside those three basically. But having a plan, having a strategy is ultra important, because otherwise you'll get chewed up and spat out.
What about the sellers? What are the most common mistakes you'll see from a seller during an auction campaign? And maybe give us an example.
Yeah, well, I think what we see at the moment is sometimes it can be hard in this sort of market for sellers to reconcile that their property is going to fetch a price that is not what they anticipated. And that can be a very hard thing to sort of swallow. And sometimes we see sellers either not coming to that realization at all or coming to it far too late and the market's tried to buy the property and then gone. So I think the biggest issue we see at the moment is we see that sellers can have confirmation bias, which is they'll have 3 weeks or 4 weeks worth of information from an agent, offers from buyers, feedback from buyers, surrounding evidence as to where their property is likely to sell. Yet there'll be one sale that may have occurred 2 months ago or one valuation they had a year ago, and they'll cling to that as being the key part of their decision making, ignoring all the other information, which is only because that suits their narrative and the other information doesn't suit their narrative. There's no hidden agenda through an auction campaign. It's not like, you as the agent hold buyers back and tuck them in a back room to hold away from the sellers. You're presenting everything as it is. So I just think sometimes, having that open-mindedness to say, we're going to take on all the information and assess it equally and then make our decision based upon that is really important. But the highest grade of information you can receive is a written offer from a buyer who says, I will buy your property at X.
Yeah.
There's nothing that outranks that. Recent sales don't outrank that. Valuations don't outrank that. So that should be what you're really making your decisions upon. Everything else is kind of secondary to that key bit of information.
I've probably seen a trend when I first started. The more expensive properties were generally private treaties, so listed with the price or offers over or tender or something like that. I've noticed a big shift that a lot of that prestige property now going to auction and sometimes transacting at auction. Have you noticed the same trends in the markets that you call, and what do you attribute that to?
It's a really good question. There was a stigma that high-end property had to transact in private. So that's where you saw a lot of EOI campaigns, which is effectively an auction, but it's done behind back rooms in privacy. And the reason for that, I think, was twofold. One is that they felt that the people buying and selling these homes, these high net worth homes, wanted privacy. And the second one was they felt the depth of buyers wasn't strong enough to support an auction campaign. I think what's happened is that the depth of prestige buyers, particularly here on the Gold Coast, has got really deep. So, then you're not saying, some properties we've done, for example, we did one last week where the bidding reached just short of 17 million. There were 6 registered bidders on it. That's a really good number. That's well above the average. So the depth is certainly there for that to happen. So I think that was the first thing. But I think the second thing is that the thing that was underestimated was that these high net worth individuals actually like the transparency of the transaction. The hard part about EOI, for example, is that when you come to the negotiation, you're in the dark, you have no idea what your competitors are doing, you can't make decisions based upon that. Whereas people at that end of the property sphere actually want to be able to see their competitors and then assess based upon what the competitors do. And the only forum to do that is auction. So they actually appreciate that. And if someone really, really values their privacy, which we do have quite often, where people don't want to be seen, bidding at auctions, they'll bid via proxy on the telephone. Yeah. So that privacy option is always there for them, but it just allows them to have eyes and ears on their competition, which any sound business person will tell you is a key part of your decision making.
You offer the digital bidding platform. I forget what it's called.
Auctions Live.
Yep.
Quick plug there, sponsors. Yeah, that's $100, boys. Thank you. Yeah.
How many agents are taking that and using that? Would that be 50%, 20%, 75%? How many of the agents that you work with are using that platform?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'd say the in-room events we'd probably have an 80 to 85% take up of at least the streaming element, which is streaming the auctions.
Yep.
On-site would be less than that. And I think mainly the in-rooms, what the clients that we work with in the in-rooms are trying to do is to say to people, we understand that this auction is not at the house that may be closely located to you. We would love for you to venture into our in-room facility, but if you can't do that, we'll bring it to you and you can watch it via a stream. Whereas an on-site auction, the neighbours have the capacity to walk 50 metres and go to the auction. But I do like the fact that streaming does add an extra layer to it. It means that if you have phone bidders, they get eyes and ears on the auctions. They can watch what's going on. The seller can quite often watch the stream from a different room, so they can see everything that's occurring at the auction. It's a really good visibility tool to have. So COVID saw a massive upswing in that, obviously,
Yep.
where we're doing online auctions or hybrid auctions, but there's probably been some legacy and some hallmarks that have kind of drifted beyond that.
So with auctions, they can get fairly intense. Buyer can go there thinking, 1 mil's my max, and all of a sudden 1.2, 1.3, I'm raising the paddle. What about the auction environment draws out those high bids?
I reckon there's two things. One is fear of loss.
Yes.
So it's a moment in time where you can see the property that you've emotionally fallen in love with, you've mentally moved into for the last 2 weeks. You've spoken about how good Christmas is going to be on the deck, all those kinds of things. It's getting taken away from you. But the second thing is that you have social proof right in front of you that someone else sees it at the same number you do. So you don't feel isolated like you're the only person seeing the value in the home at a certain number. You can actually look across the room and see a physical representation of someone who sees it at the same level. And that can quite often give confidence for someone to go that little bit higher and that little bit more. So that coupled with the fear of loss can then push people up to that emotional state. Look, we don't want anyone making irresponsible spending decisions. Like, we don't want them to go past what they feasibly can afford. But no doubt that's a key player in why auctions work, is it's that emotion drawn in with competition, and those two elements create premium prices.
So in Burleigh, we've seen a shift towards auctions with a lot of our listings. So I think when I started, we might do 1 out of 5 or 6 listings that was an auction campaign. Now it's probably 40 to 50%. So it's not just your big luxury homes, it's small little duplexes, nice units on the beachfront. What do you attribute that shift to?
Well, I remember the early days of auctions in Burleigh. I had to come down here and you'd be in full suit and I had to beg you to do auctions. I think the biggest change has just been that Burleigh has become such a popular area. Like,
Yes.
You'd almost argue that if it's not the most sought after area in the Gold Coast, it'd be in the top handful. And as soon as you have a sought after area, you have, demand outweighing supply. And as soon as you have demand outweighing supply, that's competitive environment, and that's what really suits auctions.
Yep.
So I think there was a number of auctions that took place down here that got amazing results that then fed, hey, Burleigh actually can and is an auction market, which then has continued on all the way now. And it's almost now, if you see a really good listing come to the market in Burleigh, it's almost unusual if it's not an auction.
Yep.
Like, you wonder, why is that not an auction? Whereas, 4 or 5 years ago or why are they auctioning
The
that?
opposite way.
Yeah.
Yeah. It definitely is stigma. Like, it used to be like, oh, they're auctioning, oh, they need to sell it. Whereas now it's, you're auctioning because you want premium price, you want to get all that feedback you were talking about over that 4-week period.
Yep. And it's almost the opposite now, where if it goes with an EOI campaign, for example, or a tender or by negotiation, you wonder what they're hiding. Why aren't they going to an auction? They mustn't be that motivated. So it's almost worked in the opposite, the opposite manner. And look, my fundamental belief is not that everything should go to auction.
Yep.
Even though I get paid to do auctions, it's not my belief. My belief is, though, that an agent should understand every method of sale and be able to deliver the appropriate one based upon the client and their needs.
So given when you're doing those large transactions, 5, 10, 15, 20 million, what do you do? Do you do anything differently than, say, if you were handling a sale for $1 million to prepare yourself mentally? Or is it exactly the same thought processes goes into something that's cheap and cheerful, or that's something in that real high end?
It's almost identically the same.
Yeah.
So, there's a bit of a myth that it's kind of, you've got to handle them differently. You handle them the same. You're there to create a competitive environment. You're there to provide direct feedback to both buyers and sellers. And if it comes to a negotiation, you're there to close down a gap. Now, the gaps may be bigger in terms of dollar value in those situations,
Yes.
but percentages, they're probably pretty similar to everything else.
What about the buy negotiation? Usually, obviously, it's someone in the 10, 15 million range is going to be a lot more skilled at negotiation than someone that's buying something for the first time.
Yeah.
So do you find that more challenging? Or
No, not really. I think it's a bit of a case-by-case basis. I think the biggest change that we notice is on the high-end things, people will stop bidding because they just don't want it enough. Whereas at lower price points, generally they stop because they can't afford and go any higher. And that's a big difference. So sometimes in those negotiations, it's more about having the conversations around why they want to buy it and what it's going to do. Whereas in the lower ones, it's about working inside financial restraints and capabilities. So that's probably the only difference. But I think most of the people in that bracket have usually relatively savvy business people. They've been involved in business transactions before. They understand how negotiation works.
Yep.
Sometimes that makes it harder. Sometimes it actually makes it easier because they understand, hey, on the other side of the coin, I've got a seller and I know what the seller would be going through because we've been through that experience a number of times. Whereas sometimes in other properties, you get a buyer that can only look at it through their own lens and sort of refuses to take on the viewpoint of what the seller might be thinking about. So I guess it's a bit of a course, horses for courses. The one thing that's different about those auctions is sometimes when I hear myself saying the numbers, it almost feels surreal. So like, you might be saying 16 million, for example, and, would you take me to 16.5? And it's kind of going through your head like, this is just an astronomical number. And I always think it's quite funny because sometimes those auctions will open up and they're like, we don't want this to open below 12, for example. And, someone throws up 10 million, like, whoa, take your tire kicking elsewhere. So, yeah, that's probably, you have some kind of little sort of surreal moments, but otherwise it's much the same.
From the outside looking in, it would be easy for someone to say that the life of a very good auctioneer would be a glamorous one. Like you drive a nice car, you get through all these beautiful properties. A lot of the times you're dealing with celebrities and sports people and socialites. What is the non-glamorous part of the job, other than people leaning on your car during auctions?
Well, I guess having to hang out with real estate agents. That's really the first one. No, I think people see the end product of work you've done, and auctioneering is what we do, but what we really are is relationship builders. We're professional relationship builders who get their payoff of calling auctions. So the life of an auctioneer in their first 3 to 5 years is going to be vastly different to what my life is like now. And you and I will both know, in the early days, it's about calling agents who don't want to talk to you to try and get them to do auctions they don't want to do. And that's the reality of your life. And you've got to get sort of through that period. I think in the drawbacks that I have in my role now is I'm in the car a lot. I spend a lot of time in the car. So it's a bit of wasted time. Yes, I'm on the phone a lot, podcasts and things like that, but it's still wasted time where, you could be elsewhere. So that's probably one drawback that you have. You do work quite long hours.
You don't have much time.
And time away from family and time away from other interests is another one. So you are sacrificing, various things to sort of make that happen. But I also am very eyes wide open in the scheme of things. I've got a very, very good job.
Yeah.
I don't get shot at. I don't get abused much. I'm not digging ditches for a living. I'm not hard physically on my body. So I've got a very fortunate position. I guess I'm grateful for that. And the drawbacks that I have are pretty minor first world drawbacks, really.
What's the weirdest thing someone's shouted out at an auction to, like a heckle, like, oh, is it on the market yet? And they hit you with something else and you're like, well, I wasn't expecting that.
Oh, the weirdest one was probably last year when we asked for an opening bid and then someone yelled out, are we on the market, before any bidding had taken place. And it was so weird that it was like, I was like, what do you mean? Are we on the market? I was like, but how could, and I was almost like lost for words. How could we be on the market? So that was one that I'd never heard before. That sort of really sort of there. We had one only a month ago where we opened up an auction with a vendor bid and then they asked, are we on the market? Like, it just shows such a limited understanding of kind of how it works, but also their only strategy was asking if it's on the market. That's not a strategy. Yeah. Like, auctions aren't bought with questions, they're bought with bids. But that was one that, I really sort of giggle about because that was pretty good. But there was one on Instagram recently that sort of blew up and got quite a few views where a lady told me to do my job. That was quite funny. But yeah, it's you do get some various situation scenarios that unfold that you sort of look back in hindsight and sort of giggle upon.
Often we get a lot of inquiry from New South Wales and Victoria. Hey, what's the price on this? What's the price guide? What are you expecting? All the same stuff. Do you see auctions remaining as they are in Queensland, I'm talking about, with no price guides, no price information? Or do you see that changing over the next few years?
No, I think it'll stay as it is.
Yep.
They changed the legislation back in 2014. It's very slow moving to get any legislation changed, particularly something of that magnitude. So unless there's a significant issue that happens and probably a politician is directly involved in it, I don't see it really shifting. I think what may happen at some point, which would be an absolute blessing, would be national legislation, which would be amazing because this is part of the problem is people come from another state expecting it to be the same and it's different. Things like the highest bidder getting first right to negotiate in New South Wales but not in Queensland, and they do in Victoria but not in Queensland, or price guides not present in Queensland but they are in New South Wales. My two wildest bits of legislation around the country, one is that in Western Australia you get 10 vendor bids. Like, what a random number. So Queensland you get as many as you like, New South Wales you get one, WA you get 10. Like, is someone counting them as you go and you get to 9 and you sort of panic because you only got one left? Like, that's the first. And the second one is in Victoria there's no registration of bidders, which blows my mind. Like, blows my mind that what we regard as the auction capital, and you can debate whether that's the case or not, that doesn't have registration of bidders. And registration of bidders is one of the rare bits of legislation where everybody wins. The sellers know that who they're selling it to and they've got capability to buy it. The buyers know they're competing against other real people, and the agents know how many bidders there are. Like, no one loses.
Win, win, win.
Yeah, and the only argument I ever hear is, oh yeah, but we have people roll up and buy it on the day. It's like, they can still do that. All they need to do is hand their license over.
30 seconds.
But can you imagine, Will, when we walk into one of our auctions, and you always get good crowds at your auctions, we walk in and there's 60 people there, and you don't know if you have 0 bidders or 60.
No, it's so confusing.
Wouldn't it?
Oh.
Yeah. So that just blows my mind. So thankfully we're in the lucky state here in Queensland where our legislation, while not perfect, is in front of others.
Have you seen like a decrease in buyer depth in some price ranges due to cost of living, cost of everything going up, or no?
I don't think it's down to cost of living. I think the decrease in buyer depth we've seen is just uncertainty around the market.
Yep.
This year we've had a bit of a perfect storm where we've had Queensland election. There's been a national election next year. There's a US election, which all creates just doubt in people's minds.
Yep.
There's also interest rate uncertainty. Are they going to go up? Are they going to go down? Are they going to get held? So there's just been a lot of people that are holding off.
Sitting on the fence.
Yeah, and that holding off has created a lack of buyer depth. One thing we have noticed, though, is that the premium buyers are probably still present. It's just the supporting people that were bolstering it that have probably dropped away. The only other thing we've noticed is usually there's a gap now between your best buyer and everybody else. And that gap can quite often be quite significant. So that's just some challenges we've had to navigate through this year in particular. But the market's still in a really good state, I think.
If we were looking at your Spotify account, what would be the most played song on there?
Oh,
No lying.
most played song.
Well, you'd be your top song on, like, you know how it goes to like your favorites, like always
Yeah.
played? Like it goes. Something
I
like
would,
Boss.
well, yeah, Bruce Springsteen would get a real run at it. I reckon the top played
No
song.
Matchbox 20.
No,
Matchbox 20?
I don't mind Matchbox, but they're probably not in the top couple. I reckon Coldplay would be pretty frequent.
Yeah.
And probably if I had to choose a song, probably Viva La Vida by Coldplay would be, I reckon that'd be the most played one.
What is the biggest change you've seen in real estate since going into real estate? So it could be technology, agents aren't wearing socks, whatever it is,
The accessibility of information. So when I started, if a buyer wanted to know information around a sale or something, they had to go through an agent to access that information. These days, the buyers and sellers have access to as much information as an agent does. So that access and visibility of information leaves them better informed, and they don't rely on the agent as much as they used to for guidance. So the role of an agent has probably changed. That and you wearing polo shirts instead of the oversized horrendous suits you used to wear.
Heavy. Do you need to be short to be an auctioneer?
No, but it helps. You're closer to the ground, so you're more like in tune with the crowd. You don't want to be above the crowd. There's no angle up there. You want to be down and part of the people.
Thank you so much, Justin, for your insight. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure, Will.